I've been sharing real-life supernatural experiences from Fabulous Folklore listeners for the past couple of weeks, and it's been brilliant to see how vulnerable people have been in sharing these, since talking about such things can often earn you a strong amount of scorn. But I really think it's important to preserve these stories, A, to honour the experience itself, B, to create a space where people who've had them can feel less alone, and C, just add to that body of knowledge about such things that happen. And that's what helps to make them become part of the background radiation of our lives, as it were. Now, it has also been very fascinating to see how the experiences are rarely outright terrifying, but instead are just unsettling enough to disrupt normality. So let's hear about these last lot of these experiences in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. Today marks All Souls Day, if you're listening to this on the 2nd of November, and in the Catholic Church it marks the day to pray for the departed in purgatory, and a requiem mass might be offered for the dead. Now, I wanted to set this out just a little bit of time before we get into supernatural experiences to have a look at All Souls Day because of its proximity to folklore. Now, Odilo, Abbot of Cluny in France, actually set aside a specific day to honour the dead in 998 CE, which gradually spread throughout the rest of the church. Now, in Britain, it was on this day in earlier centuries that more wealthy people handed out soul cakes to the poor in their community, and you can actually find recipes for these online. Sometimes they look a little bit like spiced biscuits, sometimes they're more like oat cakes, and other times they're a little bit like fruit shortbread. Antiquarian John Aubrey even noted that it had become a custom among various households in the Shropshire area by the end of the 17th century to have a dish of soul cakes on a table in the home on All Souls Day, and visitors could then take one while saying, and I quote, a soul cake, have mercy on all Christian souls for a soul cake," end quote. Now, this evolved into the rite of souling in the 19th century when groups of the poor, often children, went door to door and were handed a soul cake for their efforts. And the idea ran that those who received a soul cake would pray for the dead of the house who provided it. Although I should point out in Carnarvonshire, people gave bread and cheese to the poor for the same reason. While praying for the dead had its roots in Catholicism, by the 19th century it was an acceptable way for the poor to ask for money or food from wealthy neighbours. And before I forget, because I had forgotten to mention it, all of this does come from Ronald Hutton's Stations of the Sun, which I really do recommend that people read. Now, as Hutton points out, surprisingly, All Souls Day was actually restored as a feast to commemorate the dead in 1928 by the Church of England. But this links us in nicely to our relationship with the dead, which we can track now through our supernatural experiences and the ways that we honour the dead. Now, our first story this week comes from Ellie, whose experience happened in Ellicott City in Maryland in the early 2000s. Ellie was alone at the time and tells the story thus, and this one even has a title which is brilliant, but this is, and I quote, The Ghost Farmer of Bethany Lane. It was a dark night. A thin layer of fog had developed, but not so much that the way wasn't cleared by my headlights. It was just like any other normal drive I would make heading out the road a mile from my childhood home. I had been that way countless times in my life and was not expecting to see anything out of the ordinary. It was not even a quarter mile to the bridge which crossed over the interstate highway, and the way was straight. There were no other cars that night coming from the other direction. Driving slowly up the hill toward the bridge, in the path of my headlights, I saw a man crossing the road. I remember thinking to myself, if he doesn't get out of the way, someone is going to run him over. Travelling slowly, no faster than 20 to 25 miles per hour, there was plenty of time for me to observe his dress, the profile of his face and his actions. It was an older man in his late 50s to early 60s. He was dressed in long trousers and a casual long-sleeve coat, which came down to just below his hips, like a modern-day barn jacket. Under his coat he was wearing a plain button-up shirt, nothing out of the ordinary. What really piqued my curiosity was that he was wearing a hat that reminded me of the type that my grandfather would wear. It was an everyday fedora of the kind that any man might wear in the 1950s. If he had not had the hat on, I might not have remarked much on his outfit. But putting it all together, he looked as if he stepped out of that time period. It gave me pause, however. I still had no inclination to think that there was anything out of the ordinary about him. I was so concerned for his well-being that my only thoughts were for his safety. The man continued across the road into the next lane and was almost at the chain-link metal barrier fence which had been installed across the sides of the bridge to prevent falls. I was at the point of almost starting to cross the bridge. What I saw next made me mentally stop for a moment. The man, who had been at the edge of the side of the bridge, had kept walking, as if there was nothing there. He walked right through the fence and out into space where there was physically no ground. There was no place for me to pull over in time to stop and turn around to verify what I had seen. I think that even if I had been able to, I wouldn't have seen him. He would have been far enough away from the bridge that his figure would have been concealed by the darkness and the fog. No matter how many times I drove past that spot after that night, I unfortunately never saw the man again. I always looked and hoped for another sighting, but it never happened. My sense was that he was an old farmer going out for an evening walk in his fields. Maybe it was to check the state of the soil, or maybe it was just so he could have some solitude, a bit of time by himself to think. Having grown up in the area, I had learned that the land under the bridge had to be dug out sometime in the mid-1960s to make way for the interstate highway. The land, which now had a giant gorge dividing it, would have been the same height as the bridge. The place where the man walked would have been solid ground. There is a house located just past the bridge on the side of the road in the direction from which he was walking, and at the time of the sighting it was still owned by a big farming family in the area. Was he a member of that family? Was he the owner in his day? These are questions I don't think will ever be answered. In any case, when I saw two members of the family, I told them about the sighting. One of the young men became very quiet and the colour left his face. He gave me a tortured look of confusion and regret. I left him standing there, not wanting to intrude on his disquietude. The story had clearly touched him. It, however, left me to forever wonder if he knew who the ghost farmer of Bethany Lane was, not only in life, but also in death." End quote. I love how that is written as well. That is such a good story to read out. But what really struck me about that one was the idea that the ghost almost seems like one of those residual ones where it just continues to do whatever it was doing in life, which is why if the land was at the same level as the road, he would then just walk out on what was there in his time, not what's there in ours. And you get that with stories where people see figures where they're cut off at the knee because the ground level was lower in earlier times and so on. So I really like that one because of the fact it's got that sense of almost this farmer's just doing what he normally does and he's kind of going about his business, completely oblivious to what's going on around him now because he's actually in that previous time, not the now, if that makes sense. And there's almost a sense as well, I think, that Ellie was quite fascinated by what was going on rather than being scared. So I thought that was quite an interesting one as well. But my next story comes from the absolutely wonderful Jessica Cale, host of the excellent Dirty Sexy History podcast, and I was really pleased that she sent something in. And her experience happened in Greensboro, North Carolina in 2019, and she describes it here. And I quote, "I have so many ghost stories, and it's like, Jessica, I am going to ask you about those at some point. But this one always stuck with me. I used to be a ghost tour guide in North Carolina. One of the stories I told was about a woman who had been murdered in the 1930s at a famous haunted hotel. She'd lived there during Prohibition and her spirit continued to make its presence known throughout the hotel. She was very beautiful and people associated her with the colour pink. People would also find strands of her long red hair in her old room like she was continuing to use it. Some nights when I told her story, pink flower petals would float down on me from the city's flower pots even when there wasn't a breeze. One night, my tour group heard the distinct sound of a body falling down the stairs and hitting the door, just as she had so many years ago. I was used to her being around, but one night, she followed me home. It started before the tour that night. I had the feeling that someone was following me, but when I turned round, I only saw the shadow of a dress before she disappeared. It stuck with me all night until I was home after work. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when I finally went to the bathroom to brush my teeth before bed. Right before my eyes, a cloud of almost smoke began to materialise beside me. I stared, thinking I was imagining it, but it did it again. I said out loud, "I'm not sure who you are, but you are scaring me a little bit. Thank you for coming, but can we talk another time? I'd like to go to bed." It stopped. I went to bed and my phone lit up. It was a text from my mother. My mother is a medium and she lives in Minnesota. She'd never been on my tour before. She texted, "Honey, a ghost followed you home tonight. She's very pretty, a young woman, and her death had something to do with sex. She doesn't want to talk about it." It was true. The woman had been killed by her lover who had pushed her down the stairs when she found out she was pregnant. I got the chills. There's no way my mother could have known that story. It's not a famous one and I'd never told her about it. The next day I went down to my car to go out to do my shopping and I saw it. There was a long red hair on the passenger seat of the car." End quote. Oh my God, Jess, how have you not told me that story before? And incidentally, if anyone's wondering, I didn't actually read any of the experiences before I put them in the episode, so the first time I'm reading them is as I'm reading them to you. And my God, Jessica, that is weird. Yeah. Has she ever come to see you again? That's what I want to know. But that is really, really interesting, particularly when you consider the fact that whoever it was kind of responded to you saying, like, "I'm a bit freaked out, can you come back later?" That is weird. That is really, really weird. But yeah, I like that one because it's almost a sense of she's gotten to know you from you doing the tour. So, of course, she would follow you home of anybody else because you're familiar. So that's interesting. Our next story comes from Selma, whose experience happened at a cousin's house in southern Idaho. And at the time, Selma was about 13, which was over 50 years ago. And about 7 or 8 family members were there at the time. Selma says, and I quote, "We were all having breakfast. I was finished and about to leave the table when Maudie, my mom's cousin, set more pancakes on the table. For some reason, I decided to have one more. With the pancake on my plate, I reached for the syrup. That's when I felt strange, and everything that happened next I had no control over. I saw my hand take hold of the cream pitcher. My mind is screaming no, but my hand did it anyway. Also, everyone stopped talking and watched me. I then poured the cream over my pancake and set the pitcher down. Then I just looked at my plate. Whatever had kept people silent broke, and it was almost like a sigh. Then Maudie laughed and said, 'Orlando is letting us know he is here. That's how he liked his pancakes. We've been talking about him, and that brought him here.' Orlando was my great-grandfather. Just a few years ago, I was with my sister when she passed, and I saw my mother come to take her away. My mother has been dead for more than 40 years." End quote. And I thought that was a lovely kind of almost homely supernatural experience, that you've got people watching what's happening. You clearly didn't know that that was how Orlando liked to take his pancakes, and it's almost like he's sort of used you as a vehicle to kind of pass on the message in a way, but like not in a necessarily scary way, just a really bewildering way, but everybody else obviously understood what was happening. So I think that's the thing that fascinates me about a lot of these supernatural experiences, how they are like a moment of domestic normality in a way that you're not expecting. And I thought that was quite interesting. And the idea that your mother came to take your sister, I think that is something that appears in quite a lot of reports. And there's something almost comforting about that. And I've talked about this before in other episodes about my fascination with psychopomps. And there's nothing to say that a psychopomp couldn't be a member of your family. And when you think of that transition being one that you probably will have on your own, because, you know, unless something catastrophic has happened, you're the only one who's going at that particular moment in time. It does sound incredibly lonely, and I think that's why I like psychopomps. It's the idea that someone comes to collect you. And if it was somebody that you knew, it would just make the whole thing so much less freaky and so much less daunting as well. So I think that that's quite sweet that your mother came to collect your sister. Now, our next experience comes from John, whose experience happened in Loughborough in about 2000 to 2001, and John was alone at the time, and says, and I quote, "A little over 23 years ago, I was living in Loughborough with some students having recently graduated. We shared a small cosy bungalow next to a housing estate, and my walks into town took me past a fairly large field bordered by residential buildings, the local hospital, a hall of residence, and a narrow path. It was a convenient shortcut back home, so one late, lazy afternoon when I had nothing better to do, I visited a nearby pub on Ashby Road. I soon grew tired of this, and after just 3 pints, I decided to head home. I've told this story before to friends, and they sometimes ask, 'Had you been drinking?' The answer is yes, but not enough to account for much of what happened next. Cutting along the path by the sports field, I took advantage of a high hedge to relieve myself, and after a while turned round to gaze across the field. As in all classic ghost stories, dusk was falling, but it was a soft, clear evening which some people would call pleasant. It was at this point I noticed a woman standing at the other end of the field with her back to me. She was of a small build with brunette hair and wearing blue jeans, but it struck me as strange that she was completely motionless. She had her back to me because she was facing a high wire fence behind the hospital, and I remember there was a scrubby patch of long grass nearby, so I assumed she was out walking her dog, or I thought perhaps she'd lost something. For some reason, I felt the urge to linger for a while, because I thought she might be in some sort of trouble, but I didn't want to startle her. However, the longer I watched, the more immobile she seemed to be, and by this time the light was fading rapidly, though I could still see her standing completely still, exactly as she was when I first saw her. I felt my heart rate increasing by the second because by now I felt, rather than knew, that something was very wrong with this situation. A profound silence seemed to surround me, which I might later attribute to the time of day, but somehow I felt I was supposed to be experiencing this. I was, in some way, being asked to pay attention. Frankly, I was afraid, so I turned around and dipped behind the hedge back onto the path. When I was about midway along, I looked across the field towards where my mysterious lady had been standing, but she wasn't there. There was no way she could have left that field without me seeing, because it took me about 4 minutes to walk from its edge to the midway point along the path. In fact, there are only 3 conventional exits, one of them back onto Ashby Road and the other 2 towards me. She couldn't possibly have managed either of them without me seeing her, even if she had decided to run for it. In the final stages of intense fear, I ran all the way home to tell my housemates what had happened. My friend C struggled as if this was the sort of thing that happens every day, but much later C died in a freak accident, and somehow I've never quite seen the world in the same way since that very strange year, end quote. I'm very sorry to hear about your friend C, and I think with this particular experience, it's funny how you mentioned the idea of like the strange silence and things like that, because that's come up in a couple of the stories, almost like there's, I don't know, it sounds a bit like a change in pressure, a bit like when you're on a plane, and there's a weird sort of feeling there that you realise that you're in a strange situation. And it would be fascinating to know what the figure was doing there, if she was related to something that had happened at the hospital or something that had maybe unfortunately happened in the field. So it would be interesting to find out kind of the reality behind that one. But I think that, yeah, that does sound strange. I mean, obviously people will point to the fact that obviously alcohol was involved, as was Twilight. And obviously you do see things slightly differently in Twilight. But at the same time, I think because of all the sensation that went with it, that does make me think that you did witness something incredibly bizarre. Now, our final experience for this episode comes from Simon from Worcester. Now, he did send me a few, and I did tell you one of them in the first of these 3 episodes, but I did decide to spread them out. And while his earlier experience happened in London, this one happened in the US, and it's quite a lengthy one, and it is a bit of a chilling one as well, so I have read this one before. But Simon says, and I quote, "My wife and I had moved from Boston, Massachusetts to New Hampshire, where we had rented a small bungalow in Cornish. It had belonged to a farming family. The old farmhouse was across the street, and the patriarch and matriarch had retired to this cottage in the 1960s after they had built it. They had lived there happily until the end of their days. I forget the name of the folks, but a neighbour of theirs had long had their eye on the property and immediately bought it when it went up for sale and put it up for rent. We were the first renters. The place was clean but shabby, and we had asked if we could paint the place as it was quite dated, nothing having been done to it since it had been built, or so it seemed. The next day we got paint and began working on our bedroom. Sarah, my wife, was done for the day and in the shower as I was finishing up. I had my back to the door but felt someone was watching me. As I turned, I saw a shadow of a small woman. I had been thinking Sarah was coming from the bathroom, but I could hear the shower was still running. I told, let's call her Mrs. Smith for the sake of argument, that we were excited to be living here, that we didn't mean to be disrespectful and just wanted to give the place a fresh look. The shadow vanished. Sarah asked me who I'd been talking to, but she doesn't like ghostly things, so I told her I was talking to myself. The next room to get a fresh lick of paint was our son's room. He was 18 months old and excited to have his own big boy bedroom. One night, as my wife and I lay in the bed awake reading late, we heard a loud thump, and Samuel, our son, began to cry. I leapt out of bed and found him on the other side of his bedroom from the crib, crying on the floor. I picked him up and held him and calmed him down. And I did wonder if the ghost of Mrs. Smith had tried to pick Samuel up and had carried him across the room before dropping him. There was one more time when we had an encounter with Mrs. Smith, and that was when we were playing chase. The beautiful large living room had an entrance on either side and a corridor round the back side which entered the kitchen, which you could walk through to the hall, so Sam could run around and around through the living room and kitchen. He loved to do that, and I would sometimes chase him or suddenly go the other way and surprise him, being magically in front of him, and then I would chase after Sam. One time I hid around the edge of the kitchen in the living room, waiting for him to come through so he would run into my arms when he came round the corner. I listened for his feet and jumped out with my arms open. He squealed and turned and ran back towards the front door along the corridor. He suddenly stopped, looking up at someone I couldn't see, screamed and turned back to run and jump into my arms. I told him not to be frightened and that it was probably Mrs. Smith who had once lived there. 2 days later, we walked over the covered bridge from Cornish, New Hampshire into Windsor, Vermont, heading to the diner for a late breakfast. I was a stay-at-home dad. Walking down the road, a small elderly lady was walking towards us. She was fairly typical, short white-haired, wearing a dated wool jacket. Sam had been holding my hand and saying this woman wanted to jump up into my arms. I guess she might have looked like Mrs. Smith, but I'm not sure, as I never saw a photograph of her, only her shadowy shape, end quote. And I think that ties in with one of the other stories that we had with children who could see things that parents can't. And I think the reaction of Sam to the woman just walking down the street does suggest a degree of familiarity, but not in a good way. So it does suggest that there's some kind of similarity between the woman just minding her own business walking down the street and whoever he was seeing around the house. It does seem that she obviously was aware that there were people living in her house because she vanished when you explained what you were doing with the paint and everything. But I think her relationship to Sam might have been a bit different. Maybe she didn't really like children, or maybe she didn't know how to relate to them, or maybe Sam just found her scary because she was a woman who wasn't supposed to be there, and actually there wasn't anything negative or anything. It's just, if you're small and there's a strange person in your house, it is going to freak you out. It's difficult to know with that one, but it is quite creepy though. And just the idea that, there's somebody still hanging around who's lived in your house before, and you're like, can you just move on now, please? Yeah, it is a bit of a strange one, that. And it is all very creepy stuff. And I did tell you that I would tell you some of my own supernatural experiences, and obviously I have added bits and pieces into the previous two. But this time I thought I'd tell you about the one and only time I think I've actually seen something. And I don't think I've mentioned this on my podcast before, though I have mentioned it on other podcasts before. But long-time listeners and readers will know how much I love visiting Edinburgh. Absolutely love it. It's where my great-grandmother's from. And I've always been particularly taken with Mary King's Close. And I've got that as a bonus episode, some of the folklore associated with that on Patreon. And I think I've done that tour at least 3 times now. But the most recent time I went down was on my own because it was part of a research trip for my Underground City novels. Now, my tour group had just made its way along a series of rooms towards Mary King's Close itself. And they basically take photos of you there in the subterranean street with like washing hanging up above you and so on. Now, I was at the very back of the group and we'd just come along this long run of rooms that were all connected to one another. And I happened to just look back along them because movement caught my eye. So I'd look back along and basically this woman in a cap and a long skirt just walked past one of the doorways as if she was crossing from one side of the room to the other, and I only saw her while she passed the doorway. And she was too far away to make out any particular details beyond the cap and the skirt. I think I remember them being dark grey, but again, it's difficult to remember. But that was all I could make out about her. Now, I hadn't seen any costume members of staff other than the guides, and ours was a man, and he was actually further down the street directing people for their photos, so clearly it wasn't my tour guide. So obviously I got down to him and I asked if there were any tour groups behind ours, because I thought, well, it might just be the tour guide for the group behind us, because obviously you go around in time slots. And he was like, oh no, it couldn't have been because the one behind us was on the level above us. Why was I asking? And I just said, oh no, it's all right. I just thought I saw someone in one of the rooms. And I can't remember his response. I think he was like really unsurprised and just kind of not really bothered. But then he was also trying to get me to have my photo taken so we could move on as a group. So it sort of didn't really go anywhere. And I remember just going, oh, that was weird. And I wasn't scared or anything because for one thing, I was really far away from it. And I was also like, no, there's got to be a rational explanation for that. But I've never found one. And I'm not a person who sees things. So it was kind of unusual. And obviously there's loads of stories of Mary King's Close being haunted. Whether it is or not, obviously nobody knows. Did I see a former inhabitant still going about their day in the close? Because again, it had that feeling of she's completely unaware of me. She is in some other time in the same place as me, but she's going about her business and she's unaware of me. And I just happen to have had a sneaky peek, as it were, into her existence. Whether she ever has a sneaky peek into the existence of the tour groups, I don't know. And I've often wondered about that about ghosts. Like, are they then suddenly just minding their own business, like doing the washing up, and suddenly being like, oh my god, there's another one of those weird groups of people in strange clothing coming through the house? I don't know. I guess that's the whole premise of the others, really, isn't it? But yeah, it was certainly a weird experience, and I just thought I would add that one in just because it's the day where we speak of the dead, really, and that was one of my weirder experiences. But anyway, I hope that you have enjoyed this particular run of episodes looking at people's supernatural experiences. I will do this again at some point, not this year, but I will do it again, just because obviously other people have wanted to tell me things as well. So I just think it would be quite cool to sort of, again, continue to build up this bank of just weird stuff that happens to people on a regular basis, because that's essentially what it is. Like, people are having these peeks into this other world, and who knows if these stories will just disappear if people don't tell them. Next week, we're going to be moving on to November's main sort of theme, which is going to be the folklore of mammals. And we're going to start with deer. And part of this is because somebody asked for the folklore of cats, deer and dogs. Now, cats I have done before, so I won't be doing them as an episode, but I thought, oh wow, yeah, deer are really interesting. There's loads of folklore about those. So I will be having a look at deer first. So please look out for that. So if you're a little bit like, oh, I'm sick of the supernatural stuff, you're in luck, because we're moving away from that next week. So happy All Souls Day, and I will see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. Or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.